Hello and welcome to the exclusive post-election discussion of MCC. In the next 60 minutes, we will discuss the current state of play and the broader social and political implications of the 2020 US elections. I am extremely happy to welcome our guests, Mr. Balázs Mártonfi, Assistant Professor of Security Studies at Ludovika, and Mr. Steven Scholl, Visiting Fellow at the Budapest Fellowship Program. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
It's been already a month since election day, but heated debates are still ravaging US. On the one hand, we see President-elect Joe Biden already naming the members of his new cabinet and preparing for presidency. And on the other, we see President Trump, who is still not willing to concede and is determined to go on with lawsuits over alleged electoral fraud. Do you think that President Trump is going to be successful in his attempts to overturn the results?
Stephen, you want to start with that one?
Well, I have met some optimists, but I'm not one of them. So, no, I do not think the election results will be overturned. Most of his legal lawsuits that he has filed have generally been rejected by most of the courts. And it's furthered by the fact that he's not disputing, this election isn't hinging on one state. You know, if this election was hinging on Pennsylvania, and whichever way Pennsylvania turned, that would be deciding who would win the election. I would say, maybe his lawsuits might work, but even if he gets one state overturned, he still has around 3 or 4 states, various combinations of them, to get over it. And so no, I don't think he has a chance. I think his claims of it going to the Supreme Court to decide, I'm not exactly sure in what capacity, how a Supreme Court case would somehow simultaneously decide all of these states. And furthermore, even if there was a case, I don't think the Supreme Court would overchange the election. I think they would fear that would delegitimize them and make them be viewed as purely a Republican political machine. So I would say he has no chance of overturning the election.
I think we absolutely agree. Even if it were hinging only on in Pennsylvania, it would be a very interesting legitimacy battle, but I absolutely agree with Stephen. Even if it went up to the Supreme Court, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I don't think either of us are, and I would posit that many constitutional lawyers would say this is not in their purview, because this is getting into a political legitimacy battle over what's going on and whose votes count and all that different stuff. So, but even if it went up to the Supreme Court in some way, I don't really see how you can turn over 4 states or 3, depending on if you get Georgia or not. So I think this is sort of settled, and in my view, this has been settled. So there's a separate post-election, post-January 20th campaign going on, a narrative campaign going on between President Trump's inner circle, the Republicans broadly speaking, and the 2 Georgia Senate elections, which I think will be key, and we'll see how this unfolds in that relationship. But broadly speaking, no, I can certainly say that I don't see how any other outcome is possible but President-elect Joe Biden assuming the office on January 20th. It will be a contentious upcoming month and a half, but while we're on this question, I think we should just explore the possibilities of what could happen. So let's, even though these were 2 firm no's, what are the prospects or what are the options remaining? Now, granted, neither of us are constitutional scholars, and again, I would be hesitant to speak even as a political scientist, but what we can say is you can get alternate electors to be sent to the December 14th convening of the electors, right? Because the U.S. system works that you're not electing a president directly, you're electing electors of the state who then go and meet in their own locale and then write down ballots, the names of the individual presidents and vice presidents to be sent up to Congress. So there's 2 ways how you can change these electors. The faithless electors, Stephen can speak to that, or alternately sending 2 separate sets of electors to Congress, right? So the state, Pennsylvania, would say, the governor would say, who's a Democrat, I believe?
I believe so.
Would say, hey, this is the official vote number. The vote number says that Democratic president-elect has won, and they would send their, how many electors in Pennsylvania? 20. Those 20 electors to Congress on January 6th and say, these are the 20 electors I send as the governor. But the state could make I would say, weak argument, the state legislator, in which Republicans are in majority vote in their House, in their version of the Senate, and can say, no, that's not the electors we should be sending. We should be sending a separate set of electors And they would say that's based on their official vote count, which the state hasn't certified, but you could make a dubious argument and send those electors there. And if this happened in both in Pennsylvania and in Georgia, and I think he has to win, President Trump would have to win either Nevada or Arizona, right? So that's not enough.
I believe yes. I think the least he has to do, in my calculations, if I remember, is if he pulls off Georgia, Wisconsin, and Arizona, he ties.
Right.
So that's like the lowest that he can get. But with Pennsylvania, he would win, but he would need Georgia, Pennsylvania, and then I think Arizona.
So at least 3 states, right? The 3 separate states would send these very dubious ground alternate electors because there really isn't much court evidence. And there's political evidence, and you can argue about that, but there's no court evidence on that. And then the sitting president of the Senate and the president and the Speaker of the House would have to certify those. So it's a long shot, and if we have to put numbers on it, what would you say?
Oh, I would probably say 99.5%. It's one of those that it really would just be, I'd be stupefied if Trump managed to pull it off. And then, of course, it would be also, even if Trump manages to pull it off, what happens immediately after? The Civil War happened because, the fact this isn't, at least, there's always an issue whenever the popular vote goes one way and the electoral votes go the other way. But to turn this around, this is a very big margin. Is it 7 million votes or almost 8 million votes that would already be overturned? So I do think there'd be riots in the street if Trump managed to overturn it. I think there would have been riots in the street regardless if Trump, no matter how, if Trump won an election night. But I think especially so if he managed to do this, because this would completely prove everything that the left thinks of Trump, that he is a dictator, that he doesn't care about the popular vote, and that he just wants to, essentially disregard what the elections say. So I said that, and that's why, for example, I think a lot of the Supreme Court wouldn't, if there was some magical case that would magically solve all 3 or 4 states, which I don't even know, I'm not a constitutional scholar either, but I don't think that case exists. I don't think the Supreme Court would do it because I think they'd be realizing they'd be building their own gallows, if they decide to step in that. So I completely second everything you said.
Perhaps not figuratively, those gallows.
No, not each year those gallows become less and less figurative.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that we can more or less agree that it's very likely that Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. But I just wonder how much can he do if the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party. And in that regard, we have a very important date, the 5th of January, when the Senate runoff election is going to be held in Georgia. Balázs, could you please explain why the runoff election is so important and who is likely to win?
I can get to the first question. The second question, on the other hand, is much more complex. Right, so in the United States, I think we've been through, and I'm sure the viewers here know, there's 3 separate branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The judicial is the Supreme Court we've been mentioning. The executive is the president and his staff, and then the legislative is Congress with 2 houses, representatives and Senate. And the House of Representatives elections has been done and over. Democrats will control the next incoming Congress's House by less than they anticipated. Republicans picked up quite a few seats, a surprising number of seats in that, but at least more than 218 Democrats will sit in the House, so that'll be democratically controlled, and the Senate is still up for grabs. Most people anticipated this would be a very close Senate call, 100 individual body. The Senate holds a number of different powers, very important. But broadly speaking, what you have to keep in mind is any president who becomes president in the January 20th has to deal with Congress to get laws passed, right? So the House and the Senate both have to pass the same version of the law, which the president then has to sign for it to become a law. Until that, it's a bill, right? And the Senate House resolution, Senate resolution. You get into a joint resolution, you call it a bill, you pass it up to the president's desk, who signs it or vetoes it or pocket vetoes it if Congress isn't supposed to meet in the next 10 days, and you can sort of veto it. If the president vetoes it, 2/3 or 3/4.
Oh, that's good. No, now I have to think back to the Kids Rock video or this
yeah.
Scooter Rock
So
video.
anyhow, so a pretty large majority of both Senate and House has to overturn the president's veto, which happens in very rare cases, usually in cases when Congress wants to demonstrate that power rests within Congress and not with the president. The most famous case, where I would argue, is the War Powers Resolution.
Yes.
when Congress said, hey, President, you can't just wage war without notifying us or without us declaring it, and lots of great debates over there. And even though Nixon vetoed it, Congress overturned it.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have to keep in mind is the president holds a number of different powers, but most would argue the presidential power really is the power to influence. And the power to have other than, lots of executive decrees you can do and executive orders, but you have to work with Congress to get stuff done. And if you have a divided government, which the U.S. has had quite a few years of its lifetime, you get into very different ways that you can achieve stuff. One thing is the president, if he doesn't have a Senate, which is of the same party, usually goes through formulations by getting stuff done which are not treaties, what you call executive orders other than treaties and all that different stuff. And if you look at how President Trump overturned a number of Obama quasi-treaties, it was precisely because they were not treaties, they were executive agreements, and those are much easier to overturn. Laws, executive treaties, and basically the third major thing I would say, if you don't have the Senate with you, or whichever party doesn't have the Senate with you, is public opinion and the court of public opinion. Because what you see is basically diametrically, usually, and in this extremely politically polarized scenario, diametrically opposed TV figureheads and then the whole media fiasco. You get into stuff where it's just unseemly. You get into debates where it will be hard to watch, I would argue, right? And Mitch McConnell and the other Senate Republicans have sort of made it clear already with the Biden's cabinet appointee. They're not really appointees at this point, but prospective appointees, right? That this is going to be contentious. So what hinges on the Georgia election? Right now, there are 48 Democrats in the Senate and 50 Republicans in the Senate. The two Georgia Senate elections, which will be starting off in a runoff in January 5th, if the Democrats win both seats, then they'll have a 50-50 tie in the Senate. But since the president of the Senate is the vice president, the incoming vice president, he will cast a deciding vote on legislations which get up to that point. So in that case, if Democrats win both Senate seats in Georgia, then they'll have the softest majority they can in the Senate. And since they will have the House and the Senate and the presidency, they can enact a lot of laws and reforms that way. If the Republicans pick up one of the two seats, then they'll have a 51-49 majority, which will give them the power to block legislations, block lots of presidential action, or, and this is the more idealistic view, give them better bargaining position when you try to get into that compromise level of, okay, what sort of legislation you should be enacting, but this may be too idealistic.
Yes, no, I completely agree, and all those points are exactly why this election is so important. And it'll be very interesting to see how they both go. It's one of those that personally I could see. This would make no sense, but I honestly could see Senate, essentially each of those seats going one way. One goes Democrat, one goes Republican. Which, if you think if one went one way, they both should. But American politics usually doesn't work that way. We love divided governments. We'll always vote for a party for one branch and then another party for another. But you're absolutely right. And I think, now what I do think is important is, now of course this is all perspective, even if the Republicans lose both elections, the Democrats still will not be able to court pack because Joe Manchin of West Virginia came out and said that he was against court packing. So even with that, they will not be able to court pack. Now, granted, Joe Manchin can always go back on his word. You can have a Republican here and there who's willing to go, though I would be surprised if any Republican would back court packing at this point. I do think that is an important win for the Republicans and something that, at the very least, even if they have the bleak news of losing both Georgia elections, that they can know that there won't be any, expanded Supreme Court. And then, of course, that's also important for the next 4 years, is if we do have this decidedly conservative Supreme Court, are they going to hinder any of the laws that Joe Biden or the Democrats managed to pass? How are they going to act? Are they going to, be very, in a sense, activist? But I mean that just as in they're going after a lot of cases, not as in the liberal activist way. So Georgia really depends a lot. I think it very much will set the tone for the next 4 years of how much power the Democrats will in fact have. Because if the Republicans pick up 2 seats, then that's pretty big obstacle for the Democrats. But it'll definitely be interesting. And I also think it'll be interesting to see, for example, the number of people who come out and vote in this election. Is it going to be a blowout for either side or another? I think if the Republicans win in large margins, that would probably boost their feelings that the November 4th election was stolen. That, oh, well, we had this election where we're more vigilant now, and now the Republicans won by a large margin. I think that will help validate a lot of their feelings. But I think if it relatively comes down to the same margin it was on election night, I think that helps argue that there was no election fraud, and that this really is how Georgia is divided.
Right, although we should get to the court backing thing you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The Georgia election will be very interesting, right? Because on average, we observe that when the elections happen simultaneous with the presidential elections, you have a 50 to 60% turnout of the U.S. electorate, which is low compared to OECD standards, but high compared to American other election standards. In the midterm elections, so sort of, which happen every 2 years when you get Congress reelected and 1/3 of the Senate, the turnout is significantly lower, roughly in the low 40s, high 30s, depending on the year. And this election will be a special election, right, on January 5th, when you have to convince people to go vote for just this one or these two things, right? Because if you look at the ballot Georgians voted on November 3rd, they voted for their two senators, the president and the vice president, state legislator. Was the governor up?
No, I don't believe the governor.
So governor was not up, but they had like 16 things on the ballot with all the other different things, that state level stuff you combine into this one large ballot, so people only have to go vote one time. And here there's just this one thing. So I think turnout is the key, and both parties are really looking to drive turnout up in that state come January 5th. Both parties understand that this is going to be a litmus test of lots of different things. I would be, as a political scientist, would be hesitant to draw any conclusions about voter turnout there versus, and then representation there versus on the night of November the 3rd, just because of so many other factors. But political parties are usually not bound by political science, so they will make a case. Exactly. This is what this means. Now, most political scientists, and I will also tell them that's not quite what it means, but politics is politics, so I anticipate this will be contentious.
I do too. Personally, I suspect if I had to bet, I do think Republicans, I would probably bet on the Republicans, just because I'm not entirely sure. I just think the Democrats were helped out quite a bit through absentee ballots. I meant to look it up, but I'm not exactly sure what role absentee ballots will play in this special election. What percentage of the ballots will be absentee ballots. And if it's a low portion of the special election, if it's going to be mostly in person, that's going to be tough for the Democrats to overcome, because that's where they really were able to pull out a lot of people in November 4th, is through that absentee ballot. So you're absolutely right. With these special elections, who are the people who are actually voting? The people who are extremely dedicated, who are extremely political. If you don't, if you're not that political, voting for one person doesn't have that much of a draw. So yes, it'll be very interesting to see which side comes out, and I think that's where you'll see where the passion is. And I believe Trump's even going down to Georgia this Saturday. I remember seeing Facebook. I'm sure that'll be part of it.
That's usually part of the right? State.
Which I just a small thing. I think it is, to speak to it, that even if Trump knows, I do like to think, as much as we say about it, I'd like to think Trump probably knows he's not going to be president. That might be idealistic, but I do think it says something that he's still trying to save the Senate. Even if he knows that he's not going to be president. And so I do think that's interesting that he's still going out there for the Senate.
Here's the counter argument to that, just so we get a little debate going before we get to the next question. Do you think, and this is open to either of you, do you think that the ongoing debating the legitimacy and legality of votes pushes Georgia voters, Republican Georgia voters, to go vote on January 5th? Or do they feel like, hey, our votes don't count, we should stay at home?
I personally think that, at least, like I said, I come from generally a Republican household, and they definitely all think the election was stolen. But their whole mantra is, well, we got the Democrats now. We'll know what to expect. And it's one of those that we're finally talking about it. Because there's always been an undercurrent that, these Democratic city machines always manage to, somehow pump out these massive amounts of votes. And but nobody talks about it, but now we're talking about it. So I do think they will go out and vote. I don't rule that out as a possibility that a lot of people are just like, well, my vote doesn't matter, you know? But I think if you are also that convinced, you know, to me, the fact that you really think the other side has stole your vote, and you think that little of the other side, that they have stolen your vote, to me that tells me you're a very politicized person, at least on your side. You're very much a believer, you know, in what Trump, peddles, or espouses. And so to me, if Trump tells you to vote, you're going to vote and follow him. Because I mean, he told you that the election was wrong, and you believe him. So I think they'll do what he says, you know, and he's strongly pushing out to vote.
So still on the point, do you think that the fact that Donald Trump's and Joe Biden's names are not going to be displayed on the ticket, this is somehow going to influence voters' behavior, that maybe they are going to be more reluctant to go to ballots?
Yeah, this is sort of the whole people turn out on presidential election years in much statistically significant and significantly higher rates, almost 50% more turnout than they do in midterm elections and on such smaller elections, even though this will be a highly contentious one. I would argue definitely, and I think Stephen has a good point over here. We might witness the fact that, say, Loeffler wins the special election and the regular election.
It's Ossoff and Perdue. Is that
Yeah.
two names? I think Ossoff. Yeah.
Ossoff, yeah. And Ossoff, the Democrat, wins the other. So we might actually see that, and that'll be very interesting. But the most recent polls, it's complete toss-up.
Yeah.
It's too close to call. Regardless of, you know, if you may believe in whichever polling system you like to believe in, and whether you believe in polling systems or not, but I think the next, I think early voting is starting soon in Georgia. I don't know, so this gets into weird Byzantine election laws. Absentee ballots, I think, are already being mailed out for people who request them.
They usually mail them out a couple of weeks. Like I said, we're heading. You know, it's one of those. I still think it's November 5th. You know, it's one of those. It's December.
Right. Yeah.
So it is, and I think it will also be interesting to see how the Republican governor and the state secretary react to this election, because they have been under so much fire from Trump and from his supports that essentially, oh, these are all traitors. You know. So the question is, do they take those insults and stand firm against them as, okay, well, you've ticked us off, so we're not throwing you guys any bones, or do they now worry, well, this might affect, you know, I don't know if the governor is term limited, but if he's thinking about his next election, does he think, well, for this election I have to really, you know, check all the signatures, as they were saying, you know, do I really need to go proactive, or else I'm not going to be elected? You know, am I going to face a primary runner, a Trump-sponsored primary runner? Because all these Georgia officials who are Republicans, have all come under extreme attack from Trump and those who advocate that voter fraud happened. So it'll be interesting to see how their behavior during this special election is. Yeah.
But they did a hand recount in Georgia right after.
They did
and the hand
I believe it's two. They've done two recounts now. Because Trump's whole thing is he wants them to check the signatures.
But you do that with a hand recount, don't you?
I have not.
I'm sorry, we assume you do that.
I would assume you do, based on, like I said, I mean, it's one of those, I don't want to say based on Trump's statements, because that's about as dubious as saying the Loch Ness Monster says something. But, Trump's whole argument is apparently that they don't check the ballots. That all they're doing is actually looking at the ballots, saying, okay, how did they vote? But they aren't comparing the signatures of those ballots to the signatures of the voter registration.
Mm-hmm.
Or those that apparently, and then there's also the issue of, do these ballots have envelopes? And if they don't have envelopes, they shouldn't be counted.
Yeah.
And so he wants like a full, like you're going through every single ballot. But they've done two recounts now, I believe.
And both, actually, I don't know, there was not a significant margin difference.
No, Trump gained, they found a couple thousand votes in, I believe, the audit, not the recount. So there was originally the audit.
That's different.
And then that was the initial thing that happened. And then there was also the recount. The audit narrowed, it was at the very least a couple hundred votes for Trump that were added to it, which, doesn't help those who thought it was still, they're like, oh, well, see, there you go. It did add more than what was expected for
But the
Trump.
recounts actually shifted it the other way, but 10 votes or so very low.
Yes, and I believe the Wisconsin recount added a couple votes for Biden.
Right.
So
my understanding is recounts usually, except that 2001 where it didn't actually change anything, it was just closer, right? It went from 900 margin to 525 vote margin. Yeah.
When of course, and then they stopped the recount.
So that's a whole separate thing, but recounts usually don't affect that. Audits are somewhat different, right? Because then you look at what did you miss.
Mm-hmm.
But in no instances did either the Republican governor or the Republican state legislator in Georgia say, hey, there was voter fraud, right? So there's you can steal votes by not having those votes, kind of adding additional votes, usually at least. I'm not a voting cheating expert, but those are usually the claims people making. And I don't see, after having defended their state voting systems, legitimacy, security, and sort of strength and structure, that they can go back and flip-flop on that position coming into the January election. So I think they'll maintain that, Georgia as an independent state, even though we know how American politics work, they'll claim that we're secure, we've already certified the results, we've sent that up. So I think they'll do the same thing in January. I don't anticipate a major difference. I think they've sort of already priced in their re-election, governor re-election, and potential primary stuff over there, so I don't see a big change there.
Yeah, I think it's fair. That's absolutely fair.
So let's see what happens in January. But Joe Biden is already preparing for his presidency, and he laid out a myriad of plans actually to be executed during his presidency, ranging from climate policy to social justice. And for example, he already made it clear that he is going to reverse Trump's immigration policy, and he will try to restore multilateral relations of the U.S., and he will bring some reforms to U.S. police. But among these many issues, what are those fields that are going to be prioritized and put high on the agenda in his first 100 days?
I think you ticked off a couple. A number of these would be so President-elect Biden has a number of worries on his mind, right? I would argue his primary worry is, do they win the 2 seats in Georgia? Because if they don't win the 2 seats in Georgia, Senate can block his cabinet positions, although this is a whole separate topic which we could get into, advice and consent to the Senate, and oh my lord, lovely, great. Both Democrats and the Republicans have sort of destroyed the filibuster on 2 separate occasions, going the nuclear option, and both of them will be paying the price. But I think so. This is the major thing currently on Joe Biden's mind, because if he doesn't have the Senate, he will have to face a very different first 100 days and first 4 years, or at least 2 years until you get a number of seats up in the midterm election in 2022. So he has to think about this. He's also looking to satisfy his base. He's looking to appease, qualm, complacence, all these different fabulous words he can use as not his base, but the Democrats, part of the Democratic Party, which would be either more left-wing or more, in different terms you can use it, but basically who don't agree with Joe Biden's sort of mainstream Democrat approach. So some of his cabinet picks and some of the public policy statements he has are working on over there. And he has to, and I don't know whether this is a strategy that will or can work, but he has said it, sort of heal the nation idea is, and he has 45 years of Washington, D.C. experience, political experience, a fairly large amount, right? He is already looking to say, hey guys, on a number of issues, I will reach across the aisle, or at least I will attempt to reach across the aisle, this notion of bipartisanship, if we can get into that topic too. So I think these are the major things structurally that guide the transition teams thinking about what priorities they should state now, and that will be the things that will guide their first 100 days. I would guess as a political scientist that what they state now may not be the focus starting January 20th, right? Because what you're doing now is there's still a legitimacy battle ongoing in the United States, which, depending on your political view and how strongly you hold your political views, is either insane or insane from another angle, right? It's sort of like, why are we still talking about this? Why does it still feel like it's November the 5th, right? Why are we still here? Why can't we move on? So that sort of thing. So I think the comments and the ongoing provisional appointees and that stuff is still this legitimacy battle, and he's trying to appear that he's moved past it. He's trying to say, hey, let's focus on all of that, but the realities will kick in starting January 20th. There'll be, I envision 2 separate paths. One is sort of the high flyer things, the Paris climate change, JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, Obamacare. They always talk about it. Again, I'll trust Stephen to comment on that more. But Obamacare, Medicare, coronavirus, and something to do with the economics, regardless of what that is. But in reality, he will be facing the same stuff President Trump is facing, right? So there's not that much difference between now and January 20th in world affairs. It's not that like the American populace will shift, right? So I think he will be facing the same stuff, the coronavirus race to who gets the vaccine and when, and how can you satisfy the American thirst for American exceptionalism, along with his multilateralist approach where we should all get the vaccine at the same time. So I think that'll be very interesting because I think that's a no-win scenario for Biden. NATO summit, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, already invited him to come to summit early on, sort of reset the agenda with America's traditional allies. But fundamentally, I think, even though this will be somewhat less of a low-hanging fruit, which the Biden team can quickly pick on, is the China challenge. And that will be the theme of the next 8, 12, I don't know, who knows, but that will be the theme underlying almost everything.
No, I completely agree. Because, that's also another important thing about the Georgia elections, because the Georgia elections will determine, what areas can the president actually do something. And if a president, a lot of times what you'll see if the president does not have control of the legislature, foreign policy becomes a major part of his agenda, because that's something he can actually do a lot with. The president has a very strong leeway in foreign policy where he doesn't in domestic affairs. He can pass executive orders, but those are always, end up hurting him. A lot of times it hurts presidents if they pass a lot of executive orders, they get accused of ruling by decree, but with foreign policy, executive agreements, most Americans don't know what those are. They just think that that's a treaty. So foreign policy is really an area where presidents who don't have a legislature can go to and try and make their mark. So I think if Georgia goes Republican in the special election, you'll definitely see a reorientation towards foreign policy. I agree, of course, the coronavirus is going to be a major thing. And it'll be interesting to see, for example, with the healing of the nation, because every president who wins an election says, I'm here to heal. Even Trump was like, it's time for us to all heal as a nation, Now, granted, I certainly think Biden's probably more capable of it than Trump was. So it'll be interesting to see how those policies enact. And if you look at his cabinet, you see a lot of not extreme progressives, in it. You see old names like John Kerry, who always seems to pop up every 4 or 5 years in a cabinet position. I think he's their climate.
Yeah, it's not a cabinet.
It's not cabinet. But it's cabinet level, I believe. Right. And he's their climate advisor. So I definitely think you'll see all that, and I definitely think China it will definitely be a major thing, because that was one area where there actually wasn't too much of a difference between Trump and Biden, and that's why I think it will be a 12, 16-year thing, because no matter who wins, China has certainly become, even overshadowing Russia, as the number one threat to the United States, and both parties agree on it. And if you look at the American population, opinion polls is very anti-China, on both sides. So that's an easy way that he can go about that and claim support amongst both Americans. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what he does, because he is having to divide the line between, the progressives and, more moderate Democrats, especially since a lot of people view, the Democrats' failure in the House of Representatives, which for a party that wins the presidency but loses seats in the House of Representatives, that's a failure. And then they're calling for Nancy Pelosi to resign. I'm frankly, I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised she's, I'm surprised she hasn't resigned for that. But she's been in there so long, I don't know why I think she would step out now. But a lot of people blame it on the progressives. That you guys were trying to be, and Joe Biden specifically tried to appeal to the law and order people. He was like, I'm not going to be supporting the riots. I don't support violent actions. So I think that's one area where you can attempt to reassure moderate, and I think he will lean towards the center, because I think this election showed that progressives didn't exactly help the Democrats. There was no blue wave like they thought. It really was quite disappointing legislatively for the Democrats. Because there was a lot of debate up towards the election that the Senate was definitely going to go Democrat. That it was of course going to happen. They talked about how Lindsey Graham really had a serious threat. And
Yes, but not from the Democratic challenger.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
no. It was one of those that. So it's one of those that I think definitely the Biden administration, the next 100 years, I completely agree. It's one of those we really won't know what happens because the sand is still settling. You know, we don't. Joe Biden doesn't know what his environment looks like. You know, at this point, he doesn't know what he's going to actually, you know, he's going to be able to do. And I think when you see if he can do everything, then you'll really see where the priorities come out and what he actually focuses on. But if he can't, if he loses the Senate, I think you will see a lot of foreign policy because that's generally where the presidents go to.
Yeah, and so one small caveat, I think even if they get the Senate, Democrats get the Senate, I'm still not sure that Biden will be able to push the centrist agenda that he would like to, if he would like to, and we get all that stuff, because a number of political pundits and individuals would anticipate that this would be the moment where the progressive branch of the Democrats say, hey, now is the time. You have the House, you have the Senate, we have the presidency, and in this case, the idea of we versus them versus that Venn diagram, whole separate topic, they feel like this is the time to push the really progressive agendas, and Joe Biden will be like, okay, but here's the centrist, which also gets a little bit, and they'll say, that's not enough, do this. But he's like, let's do this will get you partway there. No. And that might block them internally, right? And then you're like, okay. So I don't know, I think, we'll see, but I don't think anyone plans for this stuff until the Georgia elections have been settled, because both are, one is a complete toss-up, it's Republican leaning, but I think, until that settles, absolutely, as Stephen said, you're basically fighting the legitimacy game, you're fighting the, how do I set up the presidency, how do I get public support, how do I get legislative support, and how do I get to the Supreme Court support, at least in principle, right? How do I avoid pushing all these issues up to the Supreme Court where they say, people say 6-3 conservative, I'm not sure I like that way of dividing it, but they're definitely more originalists and textualists in there than interpretivists. For me, judges, I understand why people use the term conservative, but I think they view the things somewhat differently.
Yeah, using a conservative liberal, I would say it's a good, not great description. It's one of those 60-70% of the time, yeah, you can that works out. But actually, a good deal of the Supreme Court cases are unanimous. That was one of the things that always shocked me when I first learned, because I had to admit the same thing. I was like, oh, okay, it will always be the Republican appointees, it will always be against them, and they don't get anything. There's actually quite a bit of cases where the Supreme Court is completely unanimous, and you had Scalia agreeing with Ginsburg, which they definitely have different ideologies, and you're right, and that's why the Supreme Court, I think amongst itself, it's certainly politicized outside, but I think amongst itself, the Supreme Court is very unpoliticized. We really do have this sensation of, we're all judges. And while everyone else looks in at a form of politicization and polarization within the Supreme Court, there is definitely, I think, much less of that amongst themselves. Because you saw it with Scalia and Ginsburg, they incredibly had great respect for each other. And in a lot of cases, they did agree. It was one of those, it was just that in the big name cases, the cases you actually hear about, because that's the thing, what cases, do you hear about it when the Supreme Court decides a unanimous case about some random, order? No, you don't. You hear about it when gay marriage comes up, when Obamacare comes up, all these big names. And of course, those cases do become divided, and they are generally along political lines, but those aren't the norms. Those are just what the media reports, because they're the flashpoints.
Right. So we see three little political signs, three biases ongoing here. You have a selection bias, the heteroscedasticity error, if you want to use the proper term, where all these Supreme Court cases, you pick a couple of them which you say is representative of the whole. It's not representative of the whole, as Stephen pointed out. Most of this stuff, they work through it. Yeah. They talk through it, and then I would even hesitate to use the word one narrative wins over the other. These are usually justifiable issues where they go through and someone says, hey, this is it, and they agree, and then it's usually compromise in the sense of their interpretation of the Constitution and the unanimous decision. So if it's a selection bias issue, you have an anchoring bias issue, because you pick these cases and you don't even think about whether they're representative of the whole or not. You just say, hey, so the Supreme Court, yes, it's a conservative liberal bias because I understand what that means, and you get into the confirmation bias of I want to view the court that way, therefore I view the court that way, and that's the information. I get into that, and the media isn't helping over here. And that's where I'll leave it at, unless we want to get into the role of the media, but it's not helping.
No, and that you're exactly right. And like you said, you'll see surprises, where most recently, Justice Gorsuch, which is actually, I would say he's definitely more originalist and, less activist than Kavanaugh, but he sided with the liberal justices on, protection for LGBT communities under the, I forget the name of the act. But protection against sex discrimination and gender discrimination. He switched. People were furious, but he actually made that decision based on very real originalist, reading the wording of the law approach. So you definitely see these jumps. It's not just Roberts. Roberts always gets picked on as, he's the one who jumps back and forth. But if you actually look at some of these other ones, you'd be surprised where you see some of these supposedly, that's definitely a liberal, ends up agreeing with some of the conservatives and vice versa.
As a law graduate, I would be happy to continue this discussion, but I think that we'll have to get back to foreign policy because probably we can talk about it without knowing who is going to control the Senate finally. Do you think that in terms of China, because it seems that it's going to be among the top issues, do you think that Joe Biden will have the same hardline approach towards China that President Trump had?
I definitely think he will. I think definitely based on all of his rhetoric that he's approached, he's all about, let's get back to normal of restoring, whatever word you want to use, liberal hegemonic order, and China is definitely one of the antagonists of that narrative, There's certainly antagonists within, we could talk about within, the liberal international order you can talk about, but China is definitely number one or number two antagonist, depending on what month it is. Sometimes Russia takes number one place, sometimes China, or sometimes Iran comes in, or North Korea. Depending on the month, there's that. But I think China definitely works because we talked about it earlier. I think it's an easy approach you can do that wins you support amongst a broad swath of the American population. Especially after this year, where a lot of people still blame China, and I think rightfully so for the coronavirus. But so you have that already antagonism that built upon that, where since you have everybody, everybody's suffering now because of this thing that came from China. So you can definitely play up on that. I think it will build into both Biden's approach of, we need to restore order to the world. We need to bring back, the rules and guidelines. And so I definitely think he will approach it. I think you will see a difference, of course, in personal rhetoric. I mean, you don't have the Trump rhetoric, which would sometimes either be praising Xi Jinping as this great guy, or then sometimes, we need to stop him, I think one area it'll be interesting is tariffs, to see what exactly Biden's approach is going to be. Because, the Democrats have gone back and forth on whether or not to be protectionist or free trade. For example, I believe Clinton in 2016 came out, I think, for example, the TPP was going to be scrapped no matter who did. So it'll be very interesting where Biden ends up on tariffs. I think if he decides to still go free trade and reject tariffs with China, I think that might be a change. If he does end the trade war with China, I think that might be a significant change. But as far as geopolitical security issues, he's the security expert, so I'm sure he can go into much more detail. I really don't foresee that much of a change. I think it will escalate, but I think it would escalate under Trump. That's not a comment on Biden. I think it's going to escalate.
It will escalate. I don't see how, on so many different levels, on political science and international relations theory, on daily politics, I don't see how you can avoid escalation. But the question is managing escalation, and the question becomes, it's normal. You have a potential hegemonic transition period. We don't know whether this period is at the beginning, the middle, the end. You don't know whether this is a transition, whether this is just the beginning of what seems like a transition, but in fact it isn't. Mm-hmm. What we do know from a political science perspective is that at least the U.S. elite is cognizant that this might be what you call a Thucydides trap, which is basically this political sciencey term for you have an established hegemon, a global power in the United States, right, who has set the rules of the game, if you want to call it that, at the international systemic level of how we run things. We run things through a number of different international organizations, which are heavily biased to favor certain great powers. Yup, but it's at least there, right? So this is not a liberal, realist, constructivist debate, just sort of what it is, right? And China is challenging that. it's right to challenge it. It's a separate state or nation state, right? You may disagree with the values China does or does not get into, right? Their mode of government, their mode of socio-economic, all that stuff. But if you look at it from a step back as a Martian who doesn't understand values, and let's leave it at the realist view over there, it's normal for a state to challenge the order as it's ongoing. This is unavoidable. But what complicates this is, and I think the idea of American exceptionalism, which drives U.S. thinking to do lots of, and I, as a political scientist, I hate to use the term good, but good, right? But it also has sort of negative effects. And this might complicate what could be a potentially peaceful transition if we get there. We even talk about, is this going to be a transition? Can the U.S. maintain primacy? If you just look at numbers, it's 1.6 billion versus 330 million. So, you'd say that in the long term, given how globalization works, you'd assume that sometime a transition would be made. But then again, there are alternate models throughout history where a smaller ruling elite kept power. Right, so we don't know. I would prefer if there's no confrontation, but getting to non-confrontation, there will be concrete, hopefully non-physical and non-kinetic. But there will be pedal to the metal. There will be brinksmanship. There will be. There's no other way to get to a non-confrontative long-term relationship, but through concrete, confrontative competition. So I think that will be what Biden has to deal with, and the question is, how much does that thematize everything? I would argue in foreign policy pretty heavily, even trade politics. Like in 2016, right? You had Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, carefully sidestepping the TPP as much as she could, right? Because she was hedged between the free trade idea and how many Americans are losing their jobs in Washington and Oregon and all that stuff towards China and the whole China challenge. So she tried to avoid that lose-lose political scenario as much as she could. You can no longer do that. This thing is here. The coronavirus has accelerated the whole dynamic to the point where there's some individuals who think that, this might have been the last chance for the U.S. to retain global leadership. And the whole, that's why I mentioned the vaccine distribution thing. That will be not a real litmus test. There's no, in my understanding, there's no major economic difference whether you get the appropriate amount. Plus, this is a long-term process when you get the vaccines. There's no major difference between you get it on April 1st or April 2nd or April 5th, but there's a huge political difference as to whether you can maintain the leadership role in this thing and whose vaccine works. And interestingly, if you listen to the Hungarian media, the US media, we're talking about the Russian vaccines, Sputnik 5, we're talking about AstraZeneca, we're talking about Moderna, we're talking about Pfizer, Janssen, the fifth one, no Chinese vaccine. Are they not developing it? I don't know, right? But who controls the narrative and how this whole thing gets into that's going to be interesting. And I think Biden's in a tough spot with the whole restore multilateral order, but also maintain American exceptionalism, because I don't see how you can bring the two narratives. They're opposed. You can't have one or the other. You can come up with certain creative facets or social constructs or narrative constructs of how this is good for us and good for them, but it's the only way you can do this is through complex narratives. And most individuals have so much stuff going on in their life, they just want a simple narrative. Did we win, did we lose? Which is why Trump is so successful in certain things. And I don't see how you can resolve this issue with a simple narrative.
I agree. I mean, you see, even if they said, I think, Trump, I think Biden, I said, it absolutely will escalate. And I think, for example, it's difficult, to de-escalate it, because de-escalation in the United States is viewed as surrender. It's one of those how, you saw it where, now granted, this was more colored by the 2016 election, but, Trump flirted with de-escalation with Russia, at the very beginning. And then that was very much, even within Republican circles who didn't believe Russia, did not believe in the whole Russiagate, Russia helped him win. Because you have that, because you absolutely have it. And I agree that, looking back, it should be no question, well, of course, China wants control of the South China Sea. It's the name would imply that it's right to the south of China, of course it's expanding. It has a growing economy, large population. Though, some demographics, the demographic future of China is very interesting to see if that will perhaps be one of the issues. I believe that they are actually facing massive demographic collapse in the next couple of decades. So it'll be interesting if that stops them from actually transitioning into, the world hegemon. Though of course I'm sure the United States isn't too far behind them. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how that plays out. And like I said, I think especially, you're absolutely right with this trade policy, because both parties have the infights between free trade and protectionism, because I grew up in a Republican household, and you asked me, 15 years ago if I was free trade or protectionist, I would say free trade absolutely. Free trade was the cornerstones of, to me at least, being a conservative is of course free trade. And now if you ask every single one of my family members, they'd be all protectionists now,
And the question is, what changed?
And I think it's because Trump told them that protection, it was bad, and that buy American, and that protectionism plays into American exceptionalism, buy American, it's one of those that it all plays in together.
So here's the counter narrative to that. It was free trade until the U.S. dominated free trade. It was so clear that everything was better. American exceptionalism went this way. And now that perhaps that's getting challenged, American exceptionalism stays the same. It just gets transformed into, okay, now it's protectionist because that's how we can maintain this, right? But this is an ongoing debate as to, are there democratic ideals, or is it just the U.S. mirroring democracy as a concept in the narrative according to how it functions? Right, so this is not something we can resolve in the next 10 minutes, but worth mentioning. Demographic challenges, just to further on, for our audience. Aging population.
So the aging population, I think actually the statistics is they're facing upwards of almost a 50% drop, and I believe by 2100. If I remember, maybe 2070, but I was shocked, when I saw it, because, China's population is still growing right now because they had such a large growth spurt, in the late 20th century. They know it's going to be a while before that large population actually begins dying. But no, it's facing massive demographic challenges that's actually on par with the West. We always talk about demographic collapse in the West, and especially with Europe. But no, China faces that problem. It's just they're not at the stage where people are actually dying at large numbers. But you come in 20 and 30 years, and you're going to see very similar to what we're seeing. And then of course, I wonder where's the but then you can argue, is population an adequate descriptor of power? Because obviously, the United States holds power, and a large part of that is due to our large population. We hope, India is not the most powerful country. China is still not the most powerful country. Nigeria or Ethiopia, are not huge powerhouses just because of their population. But it is something to think about in China. To go into a little bit more of that.
Yeah. So not just the aging population, I would argue, but the societal and socioeconomic pressures it puts on the Chinese Communist Party and the system itself. If you have an aging population which wants to retire, broadly speaking, that wants to have a nice life of retirement, they've worked hard, and there's an insufficient new incoming class in the strata way of understanding it to support that. So the things we face here in Europe, the things we face in the U.S., that thing's coming to China, and it'll hit them hard. And there was no solution to this in the previous Soviet realm, broadly speaking. I don't know whether they're preparing for it. They're thinking hard, right? So we know that they're thinking hard. They're pretty bright minds over there. I know that's undoubtable, but I don't know whether they have a good solution to this.
I don't think they. I 100% agree. And I mean, if we forget now because of the coronavirus, China was not doing that well right before the coronavirus. You have generally laggish economic growth, and that alone was already putting pressure on them, right? China has to produce a solid amount of economic growth. I mean, economic growth compared that you see in Western countries is not acceptable to China. Because you have to remember, even when we think about how big their economy is, but when we put into how many actual people there are there, the fact that they're only near the size of the United States but have, I'm terrible at math, 4 times the population, really means that they're 4 times as weak as the United States in a lot of ways, because they have so many more people, and yet their economic production is only comparable to a country that has a 1/4 of their population. So I definitely think, and I always like doing that because I think a lot of people while I definitely do think I would still say China's on the rise. We a lot of times have this apocalyptic version where China is on this unstoppable rise, and that as we do with a lot of other powers, and it's more nuanced than that.
Right. So Malthus thought, right, arithmetic.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We know that none of this stuff works that way. Just a nice thing to say. Yeah. So there's a number of things China faces, but I don't think the Biden administration, back to your original question, will care. Right. Great, but that's not the issue. The issue is global hegemonic dominance, or the perception of it, and the legitimate and credible perception of it, and maintaining that legitimate and credible perception through actions and strategies and policies that the Biden administration can make.
So I think we have to narrow the scope of our observation to Central Europe now. I think that we can say that Trump's 4 years was very beneficial for many Central European elements, the re-engaging diplomacy in the region, energy cooperation, Trump's support for regional cooperation such as the Three Cities Initiative, and not to speak about the ideological alliance between Trump and especially the Polish and the Hungarian government. I think that we cannot expect the same ideological approach from Joe Biden. Do you expect a paradigm shift when it comes to Central Europe?
Well, since this is an outside-in question, why don't you start, Stephen?
Well, I'll try and start where I think there will be some continuation and where things will stay the same. I think, geopolitically, even if you fundamentally disagree with Hungary's government, you cannot deny that Hungary, from a geopolitical standpoint, stands very strongly with NATO. And I think if Biden does want to, for example, still believes in a strong countenance of Russia and a strong multilateral approach, he's going to have to use NATO. And so I think as far as NATO integration, NATO, like I said, having good partners within NATO, I think that's something where he will still look for Hungary to fill that. And I think that's where Hungary can play a strong hand as a NATO partner and say that, look, we're a good partner, and I think it will continue with that. Even though I do think, like I said, but it's one of those that I do think what will stay the same is kind of the exceptions. Because I think especially if Biden chooses to approach, for example, more social values as the direction of his foreign policy with Hungary, you will see more of a shift. But I think Hungary will benefit from two things. Hungary is not on the top of America's agenda. I don't mean to insult Hungary, but Hungary will never be on the top of America's agenda. Hungary will never be the number one or number two or number three or number four enemy of the United States, even if you're fundamentally opposed to the government. You have, for example, even within NATO, you have countries that are much more problematic, like Turkey. Even, like I said, if you're not a friend of Orban, you're not going to be a friend of Erdogan either. So I think there's a lot of maneuvering room that Hungary can engage in. But yeah, to go back to the more paradigm shift, I definitely think it will be. I think it will be a return to probably the second term of the Obama administration in a lot of ways. But like I said, I don't know if, for example, some of the initiatives you talked about, obviously the new, like I said, LNG plant. I don't know if Biden's made any statement, but I'd be surprised if Biden was going to say, no, we're going away with that. No more LNG, because it's good for the United States. So it's one of those that I think a good amount will change, but there is definitely, like I said, maneuverability for Hungary within NATO. The fact that it's never, like I said, to me, maybe I'm thinking idealistic, it's never going to be the rogue NATO member, because Turkey will always be more rogue. Hungary is not engaged and, has not shot down Russian jets. It is not engaged directly, it is not, sent ships out to Greek shores, So it's one of those that I definitely think there will be much more antagonism towards Hungary, but Hungary simply is not that high of a priority where the United States is going to direct large amounts of efforts to reform Hungary or to engage it differently. But I'd be interested if a partner here has a different opinion.
The answer is I don't know. You said this would go back to the second term of Obama. I think the Biden administration, if this ever comes up, and I absolutely agree with you, this is not the number one challenge for the United States. Central Europe as a region was, and obviously Central Europe overrepresents the amount of attention this region got from the Trump administration for a number of different, but perhaps for the most simple fact that most Central Europeans don't care about 90% of what America does. it doesn't, they think it doesn't affect them. It doesn't affect them directly. It does affect them indirectly because there's no way of getting out the system, right? But so what happens is you get these selection bias issues of, oh yeah, Trump was so good to us, and it was, it's an overrepresentation of what went on, and it's an oversimplification of the Republican and the Trump administration's policies towards the region. So I think I would caveat a lot of these sentences with a number of different things. The Biden administration basically has this. I'm not sure whether this will be a conscious choice, and the part I'm worried about is that this will just be a driven by events decision. They can either go back to the Obama plus strategy, or they can approach it more pragmatically. And there's a lot of pragmatic issues where the national interests of Hungary, however defined, align with the United States. Energy diversification, absolutely. The next X amount of years over lines on Russian gas for Hungary, absolutely. The new LNG terminal in Krk. Then you get into the questions of how the Biden administration will work on climate change and renewable energy and fracking and all that stuff. But this will be something you can work on. 2% defense, again, the oversimplified story. Prognosis is 1.66% of GDP on defense for Hungary next year. Heavy modernization, $1 billion NASAMS air missile system, again oversimplifying, deal with the US. Lots of room for potential growth there. Fundamentally, I think Stephen described the Hungarian view very well. But I think the largest challenge for the Biden administration, and that's broadly speaking for NATO, the Central European region and Hungary as well, is disaggregating China from Russia. If he doesn't do that, he runs the risk of blunt forcing the strategy and the diplomacy and the narrative down to a binary choice. And in that case, if the previous 12 years of the Orbán administration are indicative of anything, they don't like to be forced into binary choices. For domestic political reasons, for party dynamics, for intra-party dynamics, for inter-party dynamics, for regional dynamics, for all these different reasons, they usually will focus on the let's fight the Szabadságharc, the freedom fight angle on that. So I would, if the Biden administration has the time, the palate, or the appeal, they should try to figure out how to disaggregate the Russia from the China challenge, because right now they're over determined into a single enemy image, and that's not the case. That's not the case for lots of Central European countries. That's not the case for Germany, for France. It's not the case for the UK. Post-Brexit, it's still a NATO member, and I would argue that's not the case for the US either. So that'll be I think that will be the fundamental question, is whether this gets disaggregated, how and when.
I agree, and I think especially, a lot of the stuff that people talk about, right? How, a lot of focus, I know at least in Hungary, was put on, for example, Biden's comments during one of his town halls, where he specifically called out Poland and Hungary. Now, he didn't explicitly, but essentially called them, authoritarian regimes. It was one of those, he didn't directly, call it, but, there was definitely an implicit connection. But, I don't think, like I said, that's actually going to be coming, any rhetoric like that, I don't think would be coming from Biden himself, but maybe the embassy in Budapest. It's one of those, I think most of you stuff you'll see from that is going to be fairly local by your local State Department, essentially. Your hometown State Department is going to be the ones who actually have enough time to engage in that kind of rhetoric. And then, of course, is it going to be anything beyond rhetoric? And I think that's still yet to be seen. Will it in fact be, like I said, will this in fact affect relationships between the United States and Hungary, or will those relationships may stay the same, but you just see more criticism? We'll still do the deal, but here's a random criticism of, LGBTQ rights, but is that actually going to transfer? Because, that's like a common adage, right? Do we ever do anything more than criticize? Do we actually ever have any change? So I think it'll be interesting to see if Biden goes beyond criticism, because I definitely think you will see rhetorically definitely much more criticism coming from the United States, and coming from, if they do ever appoint an ambassador to Budapest, you'll see more criticism. But like I said, will that criticism actually amount to anything concrete, or will it just be, we're upholding the liberal hegemonic order, and I think that's still yet to be seen, like I said, because he's not,
Yeah, and even within NATO, and I hate to term larger worries, but they're more problematic relationships.
Exactly.
Turkey, geopolitics, yes, and then we get into the Middle East, not NATO, but at least tangentially, the NATO issue, Afghanistan withdrawal, Iraq withdrawal, Iran, Israel. To be perfectly blunt, from a geopolitical angle, whether it's Orban in Hungary or whether it's whoever else in Hungary, this is not a big thing, right? Narrative, democracy narrative-wise, yes, it plays somewhat, but it also plays into the most would agree that there's an oversized influence of the Hungarian foreign policy vis-a-vis the other regional actors, mainly because there are points where people associate certain identity types to the portrayal of characters by the current prime minister. So I don't know. I would presume that the post-Brexit will be a major thing, even on the security level for both Europe, the EU, the remaining EU to figure out, because they have to pay a lot more now that the UK is leaving, and most people are just realizing that now. There's like a 5% increase in dues for all members just because the UK left. And everyone's going, huh? What? And so that dynamic, the whole financial center, and then again, back to this thing, which unfortunately I don't know when will end, the coronavirus.
Getting to Hungary, how do you think that, or how do you see the position of Mr. Szabolcs Takács, the recently appointed ambassador to the US? What can he expect from the Biden administration?
The $1 million, $1 million foreign question. Yeah, I wouldn't call that the $1 million question.
I mean, it's one of those, like I said, it's difficult to say, it's one of those that I know that, will he be, I said, of course, he's going to be here in DC, of course, before, the Biden administration came in. So I hope he doesn't, go into the Trump administration and think that's what it's going to be like for the next 4 years. But I don't think he would. But, so it's one of those, I think, of course, like I said, as a NATO member, he's going to be treated, with the general decorum that most NATO members are treated with. But, like I said, I've heard, like, obviously, there's some issues of stonewalling, whether or not, will he be able to get appointments with people? Will those appointments be, the first on the list? Or, will he be appointed to the last? It's just one of those, that goes into, like I said, the people who are, it's one of those, it's just, there's so many pieces involved with that, and it's so hard to describe, how an ambassador is received in the United States. What does it mean that he's received well? Will he get a meeting with Biden? Will he, be, like I said, in meeting with state, the Secretary of State. We'll be meeting with Secretary of State officials, Department of Defense officials. There's so many pieces going on, and it's impossible to really predict because it's not necessarily up to Biden. It's not Biden who decides, oh, the Hungarian ambassador, let's treat him terribly. So it's a very difficult, a difficult question to answer. I don't know if you can until it happens.
Or if we get to that, then there's deep trouble. if it's the U.S. president himself who has to figure out how to deal with the Hungarian ambassador, then I think there may be other priority problems at play, and that's not it. Yeah, fundamentally speaking, most people highlight the fact that Ambassador Takács is a career diplomat with successful ranks of diplomatic service. He's well spoken, well groomed, knowledgeable. What a great choice. But I usually highlight the fact that ambassador designations reflect a lot more on the internal political power dynamics and a lot less than, oh, this would be a great guy for that. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but I think that will definitely help the dynamic as much as it can. How much effect it can have remains to be seen. And then we get into the nitty-gritty of diplomacy. Did he meet previously with the new Assistant Secretary for Europe, right? Have they met at NATO forums with the Assistant Secretary for ISN, International Security and Non-Proliferation Issues? What are if Michel Fournier becomes the Defense Minister, the Secretary of State for Defense, Secretary of Defense, part of her staff? What are their relationships over there? So we get into a lot of different stuff, which comes back down in any small states, any medium powers, narrative and media issues, these are big things, but it's the State Department in the US, they have a lot of stuff to worry about, and 192, other UN members and the non-UN members, right? The observer Palestine and all these different lovely questions, so they have to have an opinion on that. So I don't, it's too early to tell. It'll be a legitimacy question, in which angle of Hungarian foreign policy does the Biden administration wish to focus on? The reliable NATO ally with increasing defense expenditure, the China challenge, the democracy challenge, the energy diversification challenge, and whether these are challenges or opportunities. So, yeah, we'll see.
Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we are running out of time, but thank you very much for this interesting discussion, and I think it would be even more interesting to repeat it once we already have the track record of the first 100 days of Joe Biden. So thank you very much once again for joining us, and thank you for your attention. See you next time. Goodbye.